Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Thales College and to our second of 3 lectures in this year's Smith Lectures on Virtue. As always, I want to begin by saying a special thank you to the founder of Thales College, Mr. Robert Luddy, and to Miss Christine Smith, whose generous donation in honor of her parents, Sydney and Cecile, has made this lecture series possible. It is my pleasure to welcome our lecturer this evening, Dr. Gregory Ganssle, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Philosophy Department at the Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. Instead of reading Professor Ganssle's bio out loud, by way of introduction, I'd like to make a few remarks about mentorship. It has been part of the DNA of Thales College from the beginning, part of Mr. Luddy's initial vision, that the professors should be embedded within the regular community life of the college so as to be available to serve as mentors to the students. Now, he might be surprised to hear it, but I think of Greg as a mentor to me. Almost exactly 25 years ago, in the fall of 2001, I joined other freshmen in Yale's long-running Directed Studies Great Books program, or DS. And for a callow pastor's kid from the mountains of Virginia, this was an intimidating transition. Sometime that fall, I became aware of this guy who taught in the program with his great red beard, who looked a little like Gimli from Lord of the Rings. And somehow I also learned that he was in Christian ministry on campus, which was a great encouragement to me to know that there was a Christian professor teaching in DS. And then I heard him lecture for the first time to the whole cohort of DS students. He was lecturing on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and it was the most entertaining lecture we heard all year, which if you've ever tried to read Kant, you'll know is no mean feat. I think he got a standing ovation at the end. I still remember, I wonder if he remembers this, he had put a bunch of Bob Dylan lyrics at the bottom of his lecture handout, which I thought was so cool. And from that point on, for the next 8 years of my life, I became something of a Greg Ganssle groupie. Anytime Greg was giving a public lecture on campus, my friends and I would try to be there. He really became my model of what a faithful Christian academic could and should be. I want to mention 2 things about great mentors that I think Greg embodies. First, great mentors make you want to be like them, and thereby show you new ways of navigating through your own life. There are a lot of reasons that I really wanted to be like Greg, but if I had to boil it down, I think it was something I observed early on that first year. As a mere part-time lecturer, Greg was very much on the low end of the totem pole in the university academic hierarchy. Not anymore, it should be said, but according to the hoity-toity standards of higher education, he was a nobody. But it was evident that everyone, not just the students, but all the professors as well, really loved and respected Greg, because Greg was just a normal guy. He was funny and down to earth, and he treated everyone the same regardless of where they were on the Yale food chain. And it was incredible witness to me to see that it was possible to cut through all the ego-driven baloney of ivory tower academia and connect with people on a human level, just as fellow human beings. Second, a great mentor doesn't have to be someone you have a close personal relationship with. Greg has always been extremely generous to me with his time, but he didn't advise me closely as he had many others he was investing in. Yet as a young person, if you're alert, all the young people in the room, you can learn a lot at a little distance from a wise older person who has gone before you. I observed Greg's actions, how he related to other people, and above all, I remembered his words. There are probably 3 or 4 things that I heard Greg say over the years that literally changed the course of my life, and countless smaller words he spoke that I took with me subconsciously. In fact, if the sign of a good mentor is that you end up passing on many things that they tell you to those that you mentor, then Greg has been a great mentor indeed, as I'm pretty sure about 30% of everything I tell my own students I've just plagiarized from him. For all these reasons and more, it is an honor and a privilege to hear from him once again tonight and to invite all of you to hear him as well. Dr. Ganssle's talk is titled Nietzsche, Jesus, and the Task of Being Human.
Thank you, Peter. That is humbling. And I vaguely remember that red beard. That is gone forever, I believe. Thank you for this kind invitation. Each human being has a task or a project. In fact, we all share the same task. This project is to navigate the world the best way we can. Each of us proceeds with the aim of being and doing certain things, but not others. We aim to do the things that make sense to us and to avoid the things that don't. We navigate the world in light of our commitments and assumptions about what it is good to do or to be. This shared task reveals that the most important question for anyone to answer is, what sort of person should I be? I call this the most important question for at least two reasons. First, it's a question that connects with every other important question. Questions like, what does it mean to be human? What is real? What has value? Is there a true morality? Is God real? And if so, what does God have to do with us? Second, it is a question that each person actually answers either consciously or by default. Each person reveals her answers to this question by how she navigates her life. We all have some idea or vision of what the good life or the better life or the best life is. Living intentionally in accordance with such a vision is made difficult by the complexity of our lives. We are each embedded in a network of relationships and responsibilities, and these rightly demand our attention. In addition, everywhere we turn, we bump into conflicting visions of what is the best life. These visions compete with one another for our allegiance. Now, suppose you walk into a coffee shop, you grab your coffee and you sit down. You begin to hear a conversation going on at the other end of the room. You glance over and you do a double take. You've never seen either person before, but you recognize them immediately. Sitting right across the room are Nietzsche and Jesus. You are stunned. The first thing that strikes you is their excellent facial hair. Nietzsche has possibly the greatest mustache ever grown. I still aspire to grow a mustache like that. Jesus has a thick, full beard like that guy on the TV show, The Chosen. Nietzsche's build is tight and thick. Although he's not tall, there's a sense of power in his stature. You expect him to pounce with exuberance any second. Jesus is taller. He inhabits his seat with a curious serenity that invites Nietzsche to continue his train of thought. It is unmistakable to you, even in your brief glance. No one else seems to notice, but it really is Nietzsche and Jesus sitting right there. Their conversation is animated and punctuated with laughter. You can't quite make out what is said, but you strain your ears. This conversation is one you do not want to miss. Nietzsche and Jesus are among the most provocative thinkers in history. To think about them in a conversation raises extraordinary possibilities. One claims to be God. The other, that God and the very idea of God is dead. One claims that the humble people are those who truly flourish, while the other thinks humility is a sign of weakness at its worst. You take a sip of your coffee and wonder, what are they talking about? Of course, Jesus never met Nietzsche for a cup of coffee. But if they did meet this way, I suspect they would talk about the most important question. What is it to be a good and true human being? Now, if you ask people who they think Nietzsche is, you're going to hear a lot of answers. Terms like existentialist and postmodernist, or maybe nihilist. And if you ask what his main message is, you're going to hear things like the death of God, or the Übermensch, the Superman or Overman. Some will say the will to power. All of these themes are developed throughout his work, and they're very important. But Nietzsche's fundamental project is about saying yes to life. His posture is one of thorough life affirmation. This posture towards life is deeply connected with all of these themes that most of us would identify when we're asked to think about who Nietzsche is. For example, he begins his most sustained attack on traditional morality by asking a question that might never have been asked to this point in history. He asks, what is the value of morality? In pursuing the answer to this question, he reveals his criterion for evaluation. So here's Nietzsche. Under what conditions did man invent the value judgments of good and evil? And what value do they themselves have? Have they up to now obstructed or promoted human flourishing? Are they a sign of distress, poverty, and the degradation of life? Or on the contrary, do they reveal the fullness, vitality, and will of life, its courage, its confidence, its future? So the whole project of morality has value for Nietzsche only if it promotes the flourishing of human life. Nietzsche is all about life. Now let's turn to a minute to Jesus. Again, if you go out on the street and ask a dozen people what Jesus is about, you'll get a variety of answers. Some will say he's a great teacher or moralist. Some will answer that he's God. Some that he's the Savior. They'll describe his message as a call to love one another. Still others will say it's about forgiveness or how to have a connection with God. And all of these themes are true and important. Just as with Nietzsche, they're all connected in his teachings. But the central message of Jesus is the same as Nietzsche's. It's also life. In the English translation of the Gospel of John, for example, the English word forgive and forgiveness is found only in one verse in the whole Gospel. But the word life is used 36 times, more than any other term to describe who Jesus is and what he's about. He did not claim merely to teach about life or to point the way to life, but he claimed that he brings life. He says things like, I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Jesus, too, is a teacher whose message is fundamentally about life. And here we see a strange convergence in the teachings of Nietzsche on the one hand and the teachings of Jesus on the other. Both see life as the central issue. Each offers a specific path as a means to the best life. Each has a particular notion of what human flourishing is and how to live it out. Now, Nietzsche fascinates us in part because he's so provocative and iconoclastic. He's not afraid to declare bold and unpopular claims. At least they were unpopular in his day. He was born in 1844 into a long line of Lutheran pastors. He was a motivated and gifted student. At age 14, he won a scholarship to the most prestigious boarding school. In this school, he was first introduced to the discipline of philology, the study of the nature and the history of languages. Tolkien was a philologist, so they have that in common. Here at this boarding school, he also lost his Christian faith. He went on to the university to study philology, and when he graduated, at the age of 24, he was appointed professor of philology at Basel University. In contemporary terms, being appointed professor was something like an endowed chair. His genius was recognized right away. Now, Nietzsche suffered his whole life from terrible health. He had horrible migraines, he had terrible eyesight, reading for any sustained period of time exacerbated his headaches, and in a few years he had to retire from the professor's job. He retired with a small pension and spent the rest of his life migrating around Europe looking for a climate that was hospitable to his maladies so that he could do his writing. In 1889, at the age of 44, he collapsed in the street and never regained his lucidity. He was insane for the 11 years that he lived after this. He died in 1900. He's been labeled, as we said, an existentialist, a postmodern thinker, and sometimes even a pragmatist. Different intellectual movements continue to be inspired by Nietzsche. Nietzsche's work has been appropriated by a variety of political factions, most famously by the Nazis. Now, Nietzsche would have objected to their use of his work, as he was a very strong opponent of anti-Semitic regulations that were being enacted in his own day. Today, he's taken as a hero by some on the hard left as well as some on the hard left, or hard right, on both sides. Both hard sides. So Nietzsche is susceptible to all kinds of different interpretations, and he's often appropriated. Now, Jesus also continues to be a focal point of interest and controversy. Although he never wrote a book, probably more books have been written about him than anyone else. We get what we know about him from the New Testament records, people who traveled with Jesus or the followers of those who traveled with him. Now, It's popular today to argue that we're in a post-Christian age, but respect for Jesus remains high. Just check your social media feed. Pundits on both the right and the left fight about what would Jesus say about issues ranging from sexual morality to political borders to which album by the Beatles is the best one. I'm pretty sure Jesus thinks it's Sgt. Pepper, and he's right because he's God. He continues to be held up as a moral exemplar. So let's dive in first to Nietzsche's project. As I said, Nietzsche is about life. In his mind, the biggest obstacle to life is that people live in the grip of forces that are deeply anti-life. He introduces this notion with a vivid image, and this is the first place he mentions the death of God in his published works. He says, after Buddha was dead, they still showed his shadow in a cave for centuries. A tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead. But given the way people are, there may still for millennia be caves in which they show his shadow. And we must defeat his shadow as well. God is dead in that he's no longer an option. Thinking people have rejected his reality, but they are still under his shadow. They remain trapped in the remnants of belief in God. Nietzsche thought it will take work and time ultimately to defeat this shadow. Some places he reckons 200 years. Defeating the shadow of God requires a revolution in our understanding about life itself. And we're going to look at three aspects of the shadow of God that must be overcome, according to Nietzsche. They are traditional morality, metaphysical truth, and Christianity itself. So traditional morality. In the work called On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche launches his most sustained attack on morality. He tells the story of how the non-moral notions of good and bad became transformed into the moral notions of good and evil. The strong, he argues, equated what was good and valuable with what was like themselves. So goodness consisted in strength, courage, decisiveness, and the exercise of power. Anything opposite to these qualities was bad, such as weakness, fear, humility, servitude. Now, goodness and badness were not moral categories in this context. But along the way, the majority, who were weak, were unable to challenge the power of the strong. And they undertook what Nietzsche calls a radical revaluation of all values. In other words, they turned values upside down. They began to call goodness what was most like themselves, the weak, rather than what was most like the strong. And they identified the characteristics of strong people and called them not just bad, but evil. They turned an aesthetic category or a preference category into a moral category. Here's how Nietzsche explains it. He says, lies are turning weakness into an accomplishment. No doubt about it. And impotence, which doesn't retaliate, is being turned into goodness. Timid baseness is being turned into humility. Submission to people one hates is being turned into obedience. Not being able to take revenge is called not wanting to take revenge. It might even be forgiveness. So it's a redefinition of these terms into moral categories so that weakness is seen as good and strength and power is seen as evil. So morality is something invented by the weak so the weak can have power over the strong. They cannot defeat the strong on their own terms, so they've changed the terms of the game and inverted all values. Now, once morality is seen simply to be a strategy of survival for the weak, most enlightened people will rethink its value. How then do we assess its value? For Nietzsche, the fundamental question is whether morality obstructs or promotes human flourishing. Morality, he thinks, demands that we turn away from the desires that characterize the strong and powerful. We have to put those down. It obligates us to embrace weakness and impotence. Nietzsche's claiming that morality takes all that promotes life and rejects it as evil. All that is anti-life is raised to the level of virtue and obligation. The assumption that our purpose and obligation is to embrace weakness and servitude is called by Nietzsche the ascetic ideal. The ascetic ideal demands that we turn from our desires to be strong and instead embrace humility. It is the ascetic ideal that is the great enemy of life. It's an obligation that puts a burden on us to turn away from what we most deeply want. He writes about the ascetic ideal, without any exaggeration, we are entitled to call it the real catastrophe in the history of the health of European man. So that's morality as part of the shadow of God that has to be overcome. The second feature of the shadow of God that must be defeated is metaphysical truth. Nietzsche goes on to ask, where will we find opposition to the ascetic ideal? And up to this point, he's launched his criticism in such a way that the reader assumes it is specifically a criticism of Christian morality. But he turns on those who would take his point as an affirmation of scientific rationalism against religion. On the contrary, Nietzsche claims that science itself is, quote, not opposite of the ascetic ideal, but rather the latter's own most recent and noble manifestation. He claims further that, quote, our faith in science is still based on a metaphysical faith. So why is science no antidote to the ascetic ideal? Because science, just as much as religion and morality, is grounded in the will to truth. Now, some readers take comments like this to support an interpretation of Nietzsche like a postmodernist, as if he's rejected all truth. I don't think that's the proper reading at all. He clearly thought his own views were true, so we can't reject all truth. He rejects what he calls metaphysical truth. In an earlier book called Human All Too Human, he describes his rejection of metaphysical philosophy. Metaphysical philosophy seeks for a higher source for the important features of human experience. And this higher source is what he's talking about when he rejects metaphysical truth. So, for example, in Christianity, human beings have a higher source. We are thought to be created in the image of God. Human nature is rooted in something higher, in the divine nature. Traditional morality is thought also to be grounded in God in a Christian view. Or it's grounded in rationality, as Kant thought. Or, following Aristotle, in a fixed and stable human nature. Nietzsche rejects this approach because he thinks there are no higher sources. Because there are no higher sources, we realize that the things we used to think had supernatural or metaphysical sources are completely natural. They are, to use the title of this book, simply human, all too human. In other words, there is non-supernatural and unmetaphysical as digestion. The ascetic ideal, then, is not merely the religious or moral ideal. It is the dominant story of Western civilization. From Plato to the present, knowledge of reality, as well as knowledge of God and morality, was thought to be ideals to which we must aspire. We have to sacrifice most of our desires to achieve these goals. It's a metaphysical faith, Nietzsche thinks, because it is a faith that metaphysical truth is of ultimate value, that truth is in some sense divine. Now, Christianity itself, as a part of the shadow of God, it's not surprising that this is the third place the shadow of God is seen. Nietzsche's attacks on Christianity focus less on the view that the central claims of Christianity are false, and more on the claim that it is one of the most severe enemies of life. Here's him on Christianity. Christianity has taken the side of everything weak, base, failed. It has made an ideal out of whatever contradicts the preservation instinct of a strong life. It has corrupted the reason of even the most spiritual natures by teaching people to see the highest spiritual values as sinful as deceptive as temptations. Christianity, as much as traditional morality, holds forth the aesthetic ideal. It commands the strong to turn away from the very things that bring life and to turn towards the things that are life-denying. Christianity is to be rejected because it is weak, trivial. He thinks that no one can even want to be a Christian. He says this, our age knows better. What used to be just sickness is indecency today. It is indecent to be a Christian these days, and this is where my disgust begins. Now, Nietzsche's disgust at Christianity rises in part because Christianity commands that we treat those who are weak with pity and compassion. For Nietzsche, compassion is a strategy to trap the strong. The Christian call to compassion makes the strong person doubt his right to be strong and happy. Rather, he has to feel deeply for those who are weakest. The very nobility of the strong is called into question. This possibility is devastating for Nietzsche. The suffering of the weak, he thinks, must be treated like an infectious disease. The strong must quarantine themselves for their own protection. At one point, he cries out, what we need is good air, as if it's the COVID vaccine that is compassion. It is striking that compassion is the Achilles heel of the strong. In every other context, the strong in Nietzsche's work remains noble and secure. They are completely independent of the condition of anyone else. The strong simply ignore those who suffer because weak people don't matter. But there's a danger lurking under the surface. Unless the strong are vigilant, they are susceptible to being infected by the weak. Their independence and stability is at risk. It's almost as if there's a reversal of power here. The strong turn out to be vulnerable. It's no wonder that he exclaims, the sickly are the greatest danger to man, not the wicked, not the beasts of prey. In another place he says, where lie your greatest dangers? In compassion. So the shadow of God includes the great enemies of life, traditional morality, metaphysical truth, and Christianity. These must be defeated. So with what does Nietzsche replace them? With life. Life, as we saw for Nietzsche, is the ultimate criterion of evaluation for everything. Every feature of human experience is brought before the judgment seat of life. Nietzsche rejects the project of showing that life is worth living. To show that life has value is to weigh it against some other criterion of evaluation. He rejects this project because there's no higher standard than life itself. To attempt to justify life against some other standard is actually a devaluation of life. He says this, value judgments on life, for or against, can ultimately never be true. They have value only as symptoms. They can be taken seriously only as symptoms. In themselves, judgments like these are stupidities. You really have to stretch out your fingers and make a concerted attempt to grasp this amazing piece of stupidity, that the value of life cannot be estimated. The fact that life is the ultimate criterion of evaluation allows us to see that Nietzsche should not be identified with nihilism. In fact, he insists that nihilism is one of the things that must be defeated. The nihilist, in contrast, requires that life be justified. So the Christians might argue that life has a sufficient justification in God. Atheists might argue that life fails to have sufficient justification and therefore is meaningless. Nietzsche rejects both views. They're both nihilistic. Life needs no external justification. It is its own justification. Now, this posture that life is the highest standard of evaluation is deeper than just evaluation. He says any view that attempts to justify life and puts something above life actually degrades life. It's anti-life. The role of God in the Christian story is especially degrading. Here's how Nietzsche describes the Christian concept of God. He says God, having degenerated into a contradiction of life instead of its transfiguration and its eternal yes. God has declared aversion to life, to nature, to the will to life. God as the formula for every slander against the here and now, for every lie about the beyond. God as the deification of nothingness, the canonization of the will to nothingness. So God is the eternal no to life because God stands above all things human. God is a slander against the here and now because God puts justification of life in another world altogether. How can life, which for Nietzsche is wholly about the here and now, be justified by something as far from the here and now as possible? It's not that he thinks God might be adequate to justify life if only God existed. Nietzsche sees God as antithetical to the value of life. So what is this life for Nietzsche that is beyond evaluation? In short, life for Nietzsche is will to power. This is one of Nietzsche's big themes. Now, when Nietzsche develops the claim that life is will to power, he often draws on biological observations. The main claim of Darwinism, as he sees it, is that life strives for survival. He thinks this is wrong. This is what he says. Physiologists should think twice before positioning the drive for self-preservation as the cardinal drive of an organic being. Above all, a living thing wants to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent consequences of this. So the will to power operates on the level of our basic drives. Nietzsche, we had to get a sense, he has a different view of what a human being is. Nietzsche does not think a human being is a substance. He thinks we are a collection or an aggregate of drives that are always competing with one another. Each person is this competition between drives under the conscious level. Some drives are strong and some are weak. The will to power then is not simply one drive among many other drives. Each drive embodies the will to power. Each fights to become expressed and to dominate the others. And when one drive dominates sufficiently, the organism or the person acts. On an interpersonal scale, it's tempting to see Nietzsche's will to power as being mostly about the permission to exploit everyone who's weaker than yourself. I don't think this is the most important part of the vision. I think it might be an afterthought. Rather, the will to power allows you to ignore everyone else. It is aimed at maintaining your own equilibrium. It takes power and strength and discipline to stand solitary and alone and unaffected by those around you. There's a fierce independence in this vision. We saw this in Nietzsche's rejection of pity and compassion. If I allow myself to get sucked into the needs of people around me, I will become weak, dependent, and entangled in the very kind of moral stance that pulls me away from my desires. The person who achieves this independence can truly affirm life. Nietzsche borrows the phrase amor fati from the Stoics. The phrase means the love of fate, or the love of what is. To love one's fate in the way that Nietzsche recommends is much more than simply being content overall with your life. A general satisfaction with your life is not what he's talking about. Here's what he says. My formula for human greatness is amor fati. That you do not want anything to be different, not forwards, not backwards, not for all eternity. Not just to tolerate necessity, still less to conceal it, but to love it. Amor fati is a posture of life affirmation. Saying yes to life that involves an absolute acceptance and furthermore a celebration of every detail of one's life. It is connected to Nietzsche's notion that there can be no higher standard to evaluate life. If there's no higher standard other than life, then there can be no standard for me other than my life. Few people, he thinks, are strong enough to embrace this affirmation. Life is the only thing that matters for Nietzsche. Everything that gets in the way is to be rejected. But we are still trapped under the shadow of God. The shadow may be around for centuries, but we must defeat it in the end. So that's Nietzsche's vision in a nutshell. You might think that was a large nutshell, but sorry. So let's turn to Jesus on life. Jesus shares with Nietzsche his emphasis on life and flourishing. From this common starting point, Jesus and Nietzsche part ways dramatically. The shadow of God that must be defeated for Nietzsche turns out to be the very path of life for Jesus. That Jesus is a teacher of flourishing is evident in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. The theme of the whole sermon is how his followers, citizens of his kingdom, are to live. And the sermon begins with the famous Beatitudes, or blessings. We all recognize the phrase, blessed are the meek, and the rest. Now, the term that translated blessed involves a pronouncement of objective flourishing. It is a statement that people with these qualities are living the right human life for a human being. New Testament scholar Jonathan Pennington argues that the Sermon on the Mount is Christianity's answer to the greatest metaphysical question that humanity has always faced. How can we experience true human flourishing? So Jesus pronounces this objective blessing. It's not just a preference. It's not just a warm feeling. This is a right life. He pronounces this on people who embody a variety of character qualities. Those who are obviously flourishing to him are the poor in spirit. That is, those who recognize their own spiritual inadequacy. It includes those who mourn for the sorrows of the world, those who are meek, those with a strong desire for righteousness and justice, and those who are merciful and who are peacemakers. The character qualities Jesus extols reflect the many-faceted profile of a citizen of his kingdom. A picture of flourishing includes the very qualities Nietzsche rejects. Rather than power, strength, and independence, Jesus extols humility and a posture of serving one another. So on one occasion, two of his followers asked him if they could have positions of power when Jesus finally came into his kingdom. Jesus' response can be seen as a direct challenge to Nietzsche's will to power. He says this, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be the slave of all." Independence is not the mark of greatness for Jesus. The path of true greatness lay in serving others. Now, Jesus did not merely teach his followers to adopt this posture of serving. He took it himself. In John's gospel, there's a great story in which Jesus meets his disciples for a meal. And the custom was that a servant would meet guests at the door and wash the guests' feet so they could recline at the table. At this event, they had no servant, and not one of Jesus' friends would get up and take the role of a servant. As they were about to recline, Jesus got up, stripped to his waist, and washed the feet of the disciples. The story continues. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should do as I did to you." Jesus embodies what it is to serve. As he teaches here, he says something striking. If I then, the Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. Note that Jesus recognizes his position as teacher and Lord. It was not in spite of this position that he took the role of a servant, but it's because of this position. Note also that he did not ask them to wash his feet. Now you wash my feet. You wash one another's feet. So Jesus comes to bring life, and he calls those who would follow him into service to others. In Jesus' mind, there is no conflict between what is life-affirming and putting yourself under others in order to serve them. In fact, unless we embrace the life of service, we wind up losing our lives. He says, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. To follow Jesus is to refrain from grasping at one's own life. It is not through trying to carve out an arena to express our independence and power that real life is found. If you lay down your life for him, you will find true life. It is here we see that the call of Jesus does not demand we turn away from life. It is a turn towards life. Jesus utterly rejects Nietzsche's whole thinking on the ascetic ideal. So let's think about metaphysical truth for a minute. Jesus assumes throughout his ministry that God is the source of all life. The best human life is found in being rightly related to God. He never argues for this claim. And apart from a couple of Romans, everyone with whom Jesus interacts had the same set of assumptions. There was a shared theological orientation to reality on which the Jewish world in which he lived was built. God created human beings, as the scripture says, in his image. This fact means, among other things, that God has purposes for human beings. And these purposes give people both value and meaning in an objective global sense. The nature of human beings is a reflection of God's nature. Our various capacities are pictures of God's capacities. God creates us to reflect his nature and to reflect his moral character. Moral goodness at its most fundamental level consists in being a mirror, reflecting God's moral character. And God's moral nature involves love, patience, generosity, compassion. It is also the case that the image of God is related to the task that is given to humans. When God created, he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves. Human beings were given a world to cultivate. Part of the divine plan for us is to bring good and true and beautiful and useful things out of this good world that God has given to us. As God creates the cosmos and sustains it in existence, human beings are to cultivate and develop the world we were given. So Jesus' position is deeply tied to metaphysical truth, the kind Nietzsche rejects. Nietzsche disdains any position that thinks there's a higher source for human beings, for life, or for flourishing. The source of everything must be found in the here and now. But Jesus points in the opposite direction. It is metaphysical truth, the truth that we are made for God and his reasons, that grounds our meaning and value. Thus, metaphysical truth is critical to our flourishing. On another occasion, Jesus addresses metaphysical truth directly. He says, if you continue in my word, you are really my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And they answered him, we are descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free? And Jesus said, very, very, very truly, I tell you, everyone who commits a sin is slaves to sin. Truth liberates us. What enslaves us is sin. We have to recall, to grasp what's going on here, that we are made for this relation of dependence to God and service and love towards one another. We either choose to live in these relationships or we choose to rebel and walk away. What Jesus calls sin in this passage is walking away. Throughout the theological story, sin is our rebelling against God, rejecting our dependence, the kind of dependence that is appropriate for creatures. Now, why might Jesus insist that rejecting our dependence on God brings slavery? Well, we were created for these relationships, and we fulfill our purpose in these relationships. Our rejection of God's purposes ruptures this relationship. Anything that ruptures our Dependence on God disrupts our flourishing. When we walk away, we step outside of the source of freedom. That's how sin produces slavery. The person who steps out of the source of flourishing is not fully free to flourish. If it's sin that oppresses, what is it that liberates? Jesus says truth. The truth will make you free. How does truth liberate? Well, there's probably many things that could be said about how truth liberates. Just a couple. Well, three actually. Jesus ultimately tells his followers, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The first thing is that Jesus is the source of all truth. We can see this theme in the prologue to John's Gospel, where John writes, all things came into being through him. Reality does have a higher metaphysical source, and as the source of reality, he is the source for all truth. The right relation to truth, therefore, is liberating. Second, the truth about who we are and our place in the cosmos is foundational to our freedom. What contributes to flourishing depends on what sort of things we are. It also depends on what moral reality is like, if there is moral reality. It depends on whether there are facts about human purpose. Answers to these questions underlie any plausible idea of what liberation might look like. And they go beyond the domain of the here and now, the empirical world. Jesus' answers to these questions reflects that life, the flourishing life, is found in our dependence on God. A third way that truth liberates is that an accurate diagnosis of what oppresses is necessary to any successful view of human flourishing. The people to whom Jesus first said these words had completely misdiagnosed their condition. They were thinking of freedom and oppression in political terms. We've never been slaves to anyone. Now, a parenthetical note, that's one of the funniest things in the Bible, because they were in Roman-occupied territory, and the whole history of Israel is a history of 400 years of slavery, and God redeeming them from slavery and the exile. So I don't know why they started to say that. It's pretty funny. But they had misdiagnosed their condition. They thought of freedom in political terms. They didn't recognize that their own rejection of God caused them to be oppressed. But you need to have an accurate picture of your condition before you can take steps into freedom. That's a principle that even if we disagree with Jesus that sin is what oppresses, we're going to agree with the principle. An accurate diagnosis is necessary. So for Jesus, life is found in growing into our dependence relationship with God and our love relationship with one another. He is the source of this life. He gives it to those who respond by trusting him. The one who joyfully embraces the offer of Jesus is the one that flourishes. Jesus' vision of life invites us out of our rebellious self-focus into the shalom of restored relationships. What rebellion ruptures, his gift of life restores. What fractures, injure, his touch heals. Where our wounded souls would hide themselves, he invites us into health and overflowing joy. He gives life because he is the life. Now, as we saw, Nietzsche vehemently rejects anything external, whether it's moral, metaphysical, or religious. All of these put something above life and thus degrade it. In Jesus' vision of life, not every external source of meaning will degrade life. The Christian source of meaning for life is grounded in the nature, the purposes, and actions of God. These features are secure. Life is a gift from God. Flourishing does not depend on our abilities to achieve it. The fact that meaning and values are gifts from God guarantees that they cannot be lost or canceled by anyone else. It is something we do not have to achieve, so we cannot fail to achieve it. We have objective meaning and value. Think for a minute about the dynamics of gift giving. I have to tell a little story. A couple of years ago, I taught a doctoral cohort at Talbot, a doctoral ministry program. And at the end of our last residential section, the students presented me with a gift. It was a signed, numbered, limited edition of Walker Percy's novel, The Second Coming. The book is valuable. It is number 99 out of 250 copies. And the special issue was released before the normal first editions were released. I don't know where they found it. The book has great value to me because Walker Percy is one of my favorite writers. If I had found the book in the bookshop, it would have been a treasure. But because it was a gift, given to me by a group of students with whom I'd built relationships, its value is doubled or tripled or quadrupled. The value of a gift is multiplied because of the value of the giver, the value of the relationship. So receiving life as a gift from God does not degrade it at all. It amplifies its meaning and its value. So that's Jesus' vision. Now, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses has been addressing the nation as they're about to go into the promised land. And he's not going to go with them. And he has set out all of his exhortations not to forget the God who freed them from slavery. And he proclaims this: "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity and death and adversity." We can say that both Jesus and Nietzsche announced this in the same sort of bold terms, their own visions of life, death, prosperity, adversity. They set forth before us two paths to consider. One that they think leads to the flourishing life, and one that they think leads to death. One towards liberation and the other towards oppression. Which will we choose? The most important question we'll ever answer is, what sort of person will we be? Jesus and Nietzsche point in opposite directions. How is a person to choose? Now, both of these thinkers offer views that I think can be plausible. But let me mention three reasons to think the vision that Jesus offers is the better vision. First, Nietzsche's vision is only for the few, the strong, those who can exert power to remain independent. Jesus' vision is available to all people. Nietzsche consistently stands in opposition to any kind of equality or egalitarianism. Jesus affirms the value of each person, especially the outcasts. Second, we all want relationships characterized by love, compassion, mercy, and joy. The vision of life Jesus holds forth captures these desires. Nietzsche is concerned that Christian vision requires us to turn away from our desires. But if we reflect on what we most deeply desire, we will see that Christianity affirms the exact kind of relationships for which we long. Finally, Jesus does not offer his teachings alone. He offers himself. He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Somehow it is he himself, and not only what he says, that is the key. And this has to do with his claim to be God incarnate, God come to earth. It has to do with his death for us. If Jesus is who he claimed to be, then he is the path to flourishing. Now, Jesus and Nietzsche are not the only thinkers that offer a vision of life, but they represent two of the most intriguing pictures on the market. Two visions of life, death, and flourishing. Each might be attractive in some ways, but we have only one life. In the end, we have to choose. Thank you.